I was standing in my garage at 7:15 on a Thursday morning when I heard the distinctive sound of high heels clicking across my driveway. That sound had become the harbinger of trouble ever since Patricia Hartwell took over as president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association 3 months ago. I had just finished my morning coffee and was about to head to my construction job in downtown Phoenix when I saw her marching toward me with that clipboard she carried like a weapon. "Xavier Yates, I need to speak with you immediately," Patricia announced, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She was in her early 50s, with blonde hair that looked like it had been shellacked into place and a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped out of the garage. "Morning, Patricia. What can I do for you?" She thrust a piece of paper at me, her manicured nails painted a bright red that matched her lipstick. "This is a formal notice of violation. You have installed an unauthorized emergency exit on the side of your property, and the HOA board has unanimously voted to require its immediate removal." I stared at the paper, feeling my blood pressure start to rise. That emergency exit was code approved by the city. I have all the permits and inspections signed off. I showed you the plans 2 months ago. "The HOA has standards that supersede city codes," Patricia said, crossing her arms. "You did not submit the proper modification request forms to the Architectural Review Committee. And even if you had, external doors on side yards violate our Community Aesthetic Guidelines Section 12.4. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that losing my temper would not help the situation. "Patricia, that door is a safety feature. My elderly mother lives with me, and the fire marshal specifically recommended having multiple exits. When I bought this house 4 years ago, there was nothing in the HOA rules about emergency exits. The rules have been updated," she said with a tight smile. "You have 30 days to remove the door and restore the exterior wall to its original condition, or you will face daily fines of $100. This is insane. I followed every regulation, got every permit, and spent $12,000 on that installation." The city building inspector praised the work. Patricia clicked her tongue. "Should have thought about that before you made unauthorized modifications. Good day, Mr. Yates." She turned on her heel and walked back across the street to her perfectly manicured lawn, complete with those ridiculous decorative rocks that probably violated a dozen actual safety codes, but somehow passed her aesthetic standards. I went back into the house, where my mother was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. She looked up when she heard me come in, concern crossing her face. "Everything all right, Xavier?" Patricia struck again, I said, tossing the violation notice on the table. "Now she is saying the emergency exit has to go." My mother picked up the paper, squinting at it through her reading glasses. "But you got all the permits. The inspector was here just last month for the final approval. Apparently that does not matter to the HOA." I poured myself another cup of coffee, trying to calm down. "I am calling Richard today. This has gone far enough." Richard Chen was a lawyer I had worked with on a previous dispute with a contractor. He was sharp, efficient, and did not take garbage from anyone. I called his office as soon as they opened at 8:30 and explained the situation. "You have all your permits and inspection certificates?" Richard asked. "Every single one. The door meets Arizona fire codes, building codes, and ADA accessibility requirements. I even went beyond what was required because of my mother's mobility issues." "And you submitted the plans to the HOA before construction?" I hesitated. I showed Patricia the plans informally. She said they looked fine, but she never mentioned anything about formal submission forms. I have been living here for 4 years and never heard about an architectural review committee until she became president. Richard was quiet for a moment. Did you get that approval in writing? No, it was a conversation in her driveway. She looked at the blueprints and said it looked like a good safety feature. That is going to make things more complicated, but not impossible. The key issue here is whether the HOA rules can actually override city building codes when it comes to safety features. Arizona law is pretty clear that HOAs cannot prohibit modifications that are required or recommended by fire and safety officials. Email me all your documentation, and I will draft a response to the HOA. I spent the next 2 hours scanning every permit, every inspection report, every email exchange with the city building department, and the original recommendation letter from the fire marshal. The fire marshal had been blunt in his assessment after inspecting my property last year. He had pointed out that my house, built in 1998, only had 2 exits, both on the front side of the house. With my mother's limited mobility and the layout of the bedrooms, a fire starting in the front of the house could trap us. He had strongly recommended adding an emergency exit on the side or back of the property. The door I installed was not some cheap addition either. It was a commercial-grade steel fire door with panic hardware, leading to a small concrete pad with 3 steps down to ground level. The whole installation had been done by a licensed contractor, inspected at every stage and approved by the city. I had even painted it to match the existing exterior color of the house. By noon, Richard had reviewed everything. This is actually pretty straightforward, Xavier. Your emergency exit is not just code compliant. It was specifically recommended by the fire marshal. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33-1806, prohibits HOAs from restricting modifications that are necessary for safety or required by law. I am sending a letter to the HOA today informing them that their violation notice is invalid and that any attempt to fine you will result in legal action. How long until they back down? Richard laughed. That depends on how stubborn they are. Some HOAs back off immediately when they realize they are on shaky legal ground. Others dig in and make it a fight. From what you have told me about this Patricia, I am guessing she is not the backing down type. He was right. 3 days later, I received another letter from the HOA, this time threatening to place a lien on my property if I did not comply with the violation notice. I forwarded it to Richard, who responded by filing a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA regulations, and sending a more strongly worded letter to the HOA board. That weekend, I was working in my front yard when my neighbor Tom walked over. He was in his 60s, retired from teaching, and had lived in Meadowbrook Hills since the development was first built in 1996. "Heard you are having trouble with the HOA," Tom said, leaning against my fence. "Patricia is on a power trip," I said, pulling weeds from the flower bed. "Now she is threatening to put a lien on my house over an emergency exit that is fully code approved." Tom shook his head. "She has been making life miserable for everyone. Did you hear what she did to the Rodriguezes? Fined them $2,000 because their garbage cans were visible from the street for 20 minutes after the truck came. The truck was early and they were at work. That is insane. It gets worse. She fined the Johnsons for having the wrong shade of white on their front door." Wrong shade of white? I did not even know that was possible. Tom glanced back at his own house. "I am retired and on a fixed income. I cannot afford to fight her, so I just try to stay under the radar, but what she is doing to you is different. That is a safety issue." "Exactly. My mother is 78 years old. That door could save her life. You have got my support, whatever you need," Tom said, "and I am not the only one. There are at least a dozen families in this neighborhood who are fed up with Patricia and her ridiculous rules. Maybe this is the thing that finally gets people to stand up to her." The following Tuesday, I received a notice that there would be an emergency HOA meeting to discuss my violation. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the community center. Richard advised me to attend and bring all my documentation. "This is actually good," he said. "It gives us a chance to present your case to the entire board, not just Patricia. HOA boards are required to act reasonably and in the best interests of the community. A safety feature that protects residents and complies with all applicable laws is clearly in the community's best interest." Thursday evening came, and I walked into the community center with a folder full of documents and a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The room was set up with a long table at the front where the 5 board members sat, and several rows of folding chairs for residents. I was surprised to see that at least 30 people had shown up, way more than the usual HOA meetings. Patricia sat in the center of the board table, flanked by 2 other board members I recognized, Margaret Simpson and Robert Kelly, and 2 I did not know well. Patricia banged a gavel on the table with unnecessary force. "This emergency meeting of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA is now in session. We are here to address the ongoing violation at 4287 Sagaro Lane, the property of Xavier Yates. Mr. Yates has failed to comply with a lawful order to remove an unauthorized door installation, and we are here to determine the appropriate enforcement action." I raised my hand. "I would like to address the board." Patricia looked annoyed. "You will have an opportunity to speak when we call for resident comments." Richard had prepared me for this. "Actually, Arizona law requires that I be given an opportunity to present evidence before any enforcement action is taken. If you proceed without hearing my side, any decision you make will be invalid." Margaret Simpson, a woman in her 70s who had been on the board for years, leaned forward. "He is right, Patricia. We need to let him speak." Patricia's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Fine. Mr. Yates, you have 5 minutes." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, laying out my documents on a side table. "Thank you. I want to be very clear about the facts here. Last year, the Phoenix Fire Marshal inspected my property and issued a written recommendation that I install an additional emergency exit due to the layout of my home and my mother's limited mobility. I hired a licensed contractor, obtained all necessary permits from the city, and had the work inspected at every stage. The final inspection was approved by the city building department with 0 deficiencies noted. I held up the fire marshal's letter. This letter states that the emergency exit significantly improves the life safety conditions of the property. The door I installed is a commercial-grade fire door that exceeds all requirements. I am happy to provide copies of all permits, inspection reports, and the contractor's licenses to the board. Robert Kelly spoke up. "Did you submit a modification request to the Architectural Review Committee before starting this work?" I showed the plans to Patricia 2 months before construction began. She looked at them and said they seemed like a good safety feature. I was never told about an architectural review committee or any formal submission process. I have lived here for 4 years and never heard about this committee until Patricia became president. "That is a lie," Patricia snapped. "I never approved anything." "I did not say you approved it," I replied calmly. "I said I showed you the plans and you said it looked like a good safety feature. That is not the same as formal approval. But my point is that I acted in good faith, showed the plans to the HOA president, and followed all city codes and regulations." Tom stood up from the audience. I would like to say something. I have lived in this community for 30 years. We never had an architectural review committee until 3 months ago when Patricia took over. She created all these new rules and committees without properly notifying residents. Xavier should not be punished for not following a procedure that did not exist when he started this project. Several other residents murmured in agreement. Patricia banged her gavel again. The procedures are clearly outlined in the updated CCRs that were mailed to all residents in January. I never received any updated CCRs, I said, and I am guessing most people here did not either. A woman in the back row stood up. I did not get anything either. First I heard about new rules was when I got fined for having my pool equipment visible from the side yard. Equipment that has been there since I bought the house in 2010. The meeting was starting to get heated. Margaret Simpson held up her hand. Let us focus on the issue at hand. Xavier, you are saying that this emergency exit was recommended by the fire marshal and approved by the city. Do you have documentation? I handed her the folder. Everything is in here. Fire marshal's recommendation, building permits, inspection reports, contractor's license, photos of the work at each stage, and the final approval from the city. Margaret spent several minutes reviewing the documents, passing each one to the other board members. Well, to everyone except Patricia, who sat with her arms crossed and a scowl on her face. This all looks legitimate, Margaret finally said. The fire marshal's letter is particularly compelling. He specifically states that the property had inadequate emergency egress and that the new door addresses a significant safety concern. That does not matter, Patricia interjected. HOA rules require that all modifications be approved regardless of city permits. We have standards to maintain. Robert Kelly frowned. Patricia, we cannot override fire safety recommendations. If the fire marshal says this door is necessary, then it is necessary. We would be creating a liability for the HOA if we forced a resident to remove a safety feature. The rules are the rules, Patricia insisted. One of the board members I did not know well, a younger man named David, spoke up. I actually looked into this before the meeting. Arizona law is really clear. HOAs cannot prohibit modifications that are required for safety or recommended by fire officials. If we pursue this, we are going to lose, and the HOA will be responsible for Xavier's legal fees. Then we need to change the law, Patricia said. Margaret shook her head. That is not how this works, Patricia. I move that we dismiss the violation against Xavier Yates and acknowledge that his emergency exit complies with all applicable laws and regulations. I second that motion, Robert said. Patricia looked furious. We are not voting on this tonight. This meeting is for discussion only. Actually, Margaret said, pulling out a copy of the HOA bylaws, any board member can call for a vote on any issue raised during a meeting. I have called for a vote. All in favor of dismissing the violation. Margaret, Robert, and David raised their hands. The fifth board member, a woman named Susan who had been silent the entire time, hesitated and then raised her hand as well. Motion passes 4-1, Margaret announced. The violation is dismissed. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Patricia, however, looked like she was about to explode. This is not over, she said, glaring at me. I will find a way to enforce our community standards. Be careful, Patricia. Richard's voice came from the back of the room. I had not even realized he had shown up. He walked forward, his briefcase in hand. I am Richard Chen, Mr. Yates's attorney. What you just said could be construed as harassment. My client has complied with all applicable laws and regulations. The board has voted to dismiss the violation. If you continue to target my client over a lawful modification, we will not hesitate to pursue legal action against both you and the HOA. Patricia stood up, grabbed her papers, and stormed out of the room. The meeting dissolved into chaos, with residents coming up to thank me and share their own horror stories about Patricia's reign as HOA president. Over the next few days, I thought the matter was settled. The violation had been dismissed by the board, and I could move on with my life. But I had underestimated Patricia's vindictiveness. The following Monday, I came home from work to find a city code enforcement officer standing in my driveway. He was a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a tired expression. "Are you Xavier Yates?" he asked. "Yes. What is this about?" "I received a complaint that you have an unpermitted structure on your property. I need to inspect the emergency exit on the side of your house." My heart sank. "I have all the permits. The city approved everything." "I understand, but I still need to verify. Someone filed a formal complaint, so I am required to follow up." I let him inspect the door, showed him all my permits and inspection certificates, and watched as he took photos and notes. After 20 minutes, he handed everything back to me. "Everything looks fine, Mr. Yates. Your permits are in order and the work was completed to code. I will file a report that the complaint was unfounded." "Can I ask who filed the complaint?" He hesitated. "The complaint was filed anonymously, but it came through an HOA president. We get these a lot. Sometimes HOA boards try to use the city to enforce their own rules." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, you might want to document everything going forward. If someone is targeting you, they are probably not going to stop." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more anonymous complaints to the city about various issues at my property. None of them were valid. The city inspector who came out the 3rd time recognized me and just shook his head. "Same person is filing these complaints," he said. "This is harassment. You can file a complaint with our office about false reporting." I called Richard again. "Patricia is filing false complaints with the city to harass me. What can I do?" "Document everything. Save every complaint, every inspection report, every interaction. If we can prove a pattern of harassment, we can get a restraining order and potentially sue for damages." But things escalated beyond what either of us expected. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, I received a certified letter informing me that Patricia had filed a lawsuit against me personally, separate from the HOA, claiming that my emergency exit had damaged her property value and caused her emotional distress. Richard read the lawsuit and started laughing. "This is the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen. She has zero legal basis for this, but the fact that she filed it personally, not on behalf of the HOA, is interesting. That suggests the rest of the board did not support this action. So what do? We file a motion to dismiss, and then we countersue for harassment and abuse of process. She has crossed a line here." While Richard worked on the legal response, I started digging into Patricia's background as HOA president. Tom helped me, and together we started talking to other residents who had been targeted by her. The stories were shocking. The Rodriguez family had been fined repeatedly for minor violations, to the point where they were considering selling their house and moving. The Johnsons had spent $3,000 repainting their front door 3 different times trying to get the right shade of white that Patricia would approve. An elderly widow named Dorothy Sanders had been cited for having weeds in her yard when she was in the hospital recovering from surgery. But the most disturbing story came from a woman named Dana Sullivan, who lived on the next street over. She knocked on my door one evening, looking nervous. "I heard you are fighting the HOA," she said. "Can I talk to you?" I invited her in and made coffee. Dana was in her 40s, a single mother with 2 teenage kids. She looked exhausted. "Patricia has been targeting me for 8 months, Dana said. It started when I asked questions at a board meeting about the HOA finances. We have been paying dues for years, but no one has seen a detailed budget or accounting of where the money goes. Patricia shut me down and said the finances were board business only. The next week, I got my first violation notice. What was the violation? My mailbox was the wrong color. It has been the same mailbox since I moved in 6 years ago. Never had a problem until I questioned the finances. Since then, I have been cited for everything. Grass too long, wrong flowers in my front yard, my kids' bikes visible in the driveway. I have paid over $6,000 in fines. I felt sick. That is targeted harassment. It gets worse. Dana pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos. These were taken by someone sitting in a car across from my house. They have been photographing me, my kids, my house at all hours. I think it is Patricia or someone she hired. I filed a police report, but they said unless the person is on my property, there is nothing they can do. Have you talked to a lawyer? I cannot afford a lawyer. I am barely making ends meet with all these fines. I am thinking about just selling the house and moving, but I cannot afford to lose money on the sale. I called Richard the next day and told him about Dana's situation. This is bigger than just my emergency exit. Patricia is systematically harassing residents who question her or stand up to her. That is a pattern of abuse, Richard said. If we can get multiple residents to come forward, we might have grounds for a class action lawsuit. But more importantly, this could be criminal harassment. Have you thought about going to the police? Dana already tried. They said there is nothing they can do. Dana went to the police about being photographed. That is different from organized harassment through an HOA. The Arizona Attorney General's office has a division that investigates HOA abuse. I think it is time to escalate this. Over the next week, Tom and I organized a meeting at his house for residents who had been targeted by Patricia. 18 people showed up, each with their own story of harassment, excessive fines, and vindictive enforcement of petty rules. Dana was there, along with the Rodriguez family, the Johnsons, Dorothy Sanders, and others I had never met. Richard attended the meeting and took detailed notes. What we have here is a clear pattern of abuse of power. Patricia is using her position as HOA president to retaliate against residents who question her, to enforce rules selectively, and to harass people she has personal grievances against. This goes beyond a typical HOA dispute. What can we do? Asked Maria Rodriguez, a woman in her 30s with 3 young children. Several things, Richard said. First, we can file complaints with the Arizona Department of Real Estate and the Attorney General's office. Second, we can organize a special election to recall Patricia as HOA president. Third, we can file a lawsuit against both Patricia personally and the HOA for harassment and violation of your rights. Fourth, if the harassment is severe enough and involves criminal activity, we can push for criminal charges. What would constitute criminal activity? I asked. Stalking, filing false police reports, fraud, misappropriation of HOA funds. If Patricia has been collecting excessive fines without proper authorization or using HOA money for personal purposes, that could be embezzlement. Dana spoke up. I have been saying for months that something is wrong with the HOA finances. The budget she presented at the last annual meeting did not make sense. Our dues went up 30%, but the expenses she listed were lower than previous years. Richard leaned forward. Do you have copies of the budget? I have the last 3 years. I asked for more detailed records, but Patricia refused. Under Arizona law, HOA members have a right to inspect financial records. If she is refusing, that is a violation. It also suggests she might be hiding something. Tom, who had been mostly quiet, suddenly spoke up. "My daughter is an accountant. I could ask her to look at the budgets if we can get the actual records." "We need to force the issue," Richard said. "Dana, I want you to send a formal written request to the HOA board requesting access to all financial records for the past 3 years, including bank statements, receipts, and vendor contracts. Send it certified mail to every board member, not just Patricia. Under Arizona law, they have 10 business days to provide access." Dana looked worried. "She is going to retaliate." "Probably," Richard agreed. "But now you have 18 witnesses and an attorney documenting everything. If she retaliates, it strengthens our case." Dana sent the request the next day. We waited. 1 week passed, then 2. On the 9th business day, Dana received a response from Margaret Simpson, the board member who had supported me at the meeting. The letter said that the board was working on compiling the requested records and would provide access shortly. It was signed by Margaret, Robert, and David, but not Patricia or Susan. On the 14th business day, Dana received a second letter, this one from Patricia personally. The letter stated that financial records were confidential board materials and that Dana's request was denied. It also included a violation notice citing Dana for having weeds in her yard and assessed a $500 fine. Richard was ecstatic when I showed him the letter. "She just made a huge mistake. She violated Arizona law by denying access to financial records, and she retaliated against Dana for making a legal request. This is exactly what we needed." He filed a lawsuit the next day on behalf of Dana and me, with the other affected residents ready to join as plaintiffs. The lawsuit alleged violation of Arizona HOA statutes, harassment, retaliation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We also filed formal complaints with the Department of Real Estate and the Attorney General's office. The response was swift. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, 2 investigators from the Attorney General's office showed up at the HOA office demanding access to all financial records. Patricia tried to refuse, but the investigators had a subpoena. They spent 6 hours going through boxes of documents, bank statements, and receipts. Tom's daughter Sarah, the accountant, volunteered to help review the records once they were copied and provided to our attorney. What she found was stunning. "This is bad," Sarah said at a meeting at Tom's house. She had spreadsheets and highlighted documents spread across the dining room table. "Patricia has been systematically stealing from the HOA for at least 2 years, probably longer. How much are we talking about?" I asked. "At least $200,000 that I can document. There are payments to shell companies that do not exist, inflated invoices for maintenance that was never performed, and direct transfers to personal accounts. She has been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, vacations, even a car lease." Tom looked pale. $200,000. How did no one notice? She controlled all the financial reporting, Sarah explained. The budgets she presented to the board were fabricated. The actual bank statements show completely different numbers. She has been forging signatures on checks and falsifying board meeting minutes to make it look like expenses were approved. "That is embezzlement," Richard said. "That is a felony. We need to turn this over to the police immediately." We met with Detective Marcus Walsh from the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit the next morning. He was a serious man in his early 50s who listened carefully as Sarah walked him through the evidence. "This is pretty clear-cut," Detective Walsh said. "Embezzlement, fraud, forgery. If what you are showing me is accurate, we are talking about multiple felony counts. I need to get our forensic accountants involved, but I have enough here to start an investigation." "What happens now?" Dana asked. We will execute a search warrant on her residence and any business records she has. We will interview the other board members and get their statements. If the evidence supports charges, we will arrest her and refer the case to the county attorney for prosecution. Things moved quickly after that. 2 days later, Detective Walsh called to tell me they had executed the search warrant and found additional evidence of financial fraud at Patricia's home, including documents showing she had taken out a credit card in the HOA's name and run up $70,000 in personal charges. "We are arresting her today," Detective Walsh said. "I wanted to give you a heads up since you are a key witness." That afternoon, I was working in my garage when I saw 2 police cars pull up to Patricia's house across the street. Detective Walsh and 2 uniformed officers went to her door. Patricia answered, and I could hear her shrieking from across the street as they placed her in handcuffs. Neighbors came out of their houses to watch as Patricia was led to the police car, still screaming about how this was all my fault and how I had destroyed the community. The arrest made the local news. "HOA president arrested for embezzlement" was the headline on the Phoenix television station that evening. The story detailed how Patricia Hartwell had allegedly stolen over $270,000 from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA over a period of nearly 3 years. The fallout was immediate. Susan, the 5th board member who had usually sided with Patricia, resigned. The remaining board members, Margaret, Robert, and David, called an emergency meeting and voted to terminate Patricia's position as president. Margaret took over as interim president. "I want to apologize to everyone who was targeted by Patricia," Margaret said at the first board meeting after the arrest. "The board should have been more vigilant. We trusted her with the finances, and she abused that trust. We are working with law enforcement and conducting a full audit to determine the extent of the damage." The audit eventually revealed that Patricia had stolen over $300,000. She had used the money to fund a lifestyle she could not afford on her actual income, which we learned was minimal. Her house was mortgaged to the hilt, and she was drowning in credit card debt. The HOA embezzlement had been her way of staying afloat. Patricia was charged with 12 felony counts, including theft, fraud, forgery, and misuse of HOA funds. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the county attorney was not interested. The case went to trial 6 months later. I testified at the trial, along with Dana, Tom, and several other residents. Sarah, the accountant, walked the jury through the financial evidence, showing exactly how Patricia had stolen the money and covered her tracks. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $312,000 to the HOA. The judge was particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks, noting that Patricia had been in a position of trust and had abused that position to target and harass vulnerable residents while stealing from them. With Patricia gone, the HOA began the process of recovering. The board implemented new financial controls, including requiring 2 signatures on all checks and mandatory monthly financial reports to all residents. They also revised the CCRs to eliminate many of the petty and arbitrary rules Patricia had implemented. The lawsuit Richard had filed on behalf of Dana and me was settled out of court. The HOA's insurance company paid damages to all the residents who had been targeted by Patricia, and they agreed to reimburse all the fines that had been improperly assessed. Dana received enough money to cover all her legal expenses and compensate her for the harassment she had endured. My emergency exit, of course, stayed exactly where it was. The new board formally acknowledged that it was a code-approved safety feature and thanked me for improving the safety of my property. They even sent a notice to all residents encouraging them to consider emergency exits if their homes had limited egress options. Life in Meadowbrook Hills slowly returned to normal. The Rodriguez family decided to stay after the HOA reimbursed their fines and apologized. The Johnsons repainted their door whatever color they wanted, which turned out to be a nice blue. Dorothy Sanders, the elderly widow, received help from several neighbors with her yard work, and the community came together to support her recovery. Tom became more active in the HOA, joining the board to help ensure that nothing like Patricia's reign would happen again. Dana ran for the board as well and won easily, bringing her financial transparency advocacy to an official position. As for me, I just wanted to live my life in peace. My mother was safe and secure in our home, with multiple exits and no threat of harassment from an overzealous HOA president. The emergency exit that had started this whole ordeal had served its purpose, not by saving us from a fire, but by exposing corruption and abuse that had been festering in our community. One evening about a year after Patricia's arrest, I was sitting on my back patio with my mother, watching the sunset over the Arizona desert. The door that had caused so much trouble was visible from where we sat, a simple metal door that had become the symbol of standing up against abuse of power. "Do you ever regret installing that door?" my mother asked. I thought about it for a moment. The stress, the legal battles, the harassment, all of it could have been avoided if I had just left things alone. But then I thought about Dana and the Rodriguez family and all the other residents who had been suffering in silence under Patricia's tyranny. I thought about the $300,000 that would have continued to be stolen if no one had stood up. "No," I said, "I do not regret it at all." The community center held a meeting 3 months after Patricia's sentencing to discuss the future of the HOA. Over 100 residents attended, the most that had ever shown up for an HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. Margaret stood at the front of the room, looking more relaxed than I had ever seen her. "Tonight we are going to vote on a complete revision of our CCRs," Margaret announced. "The goal is to create rules that actually serve the community, not arbitrary standards that exist just to fine people. We have been working with a lawyer who specializes in HOA governance to draft something reasonable." The proposed changes were extensive. They eliminated most of the aesthetic requirements that Patricia had implemented, kept only the rules that were necessary for maintaining property values and community standards, and implemented strict financial oversight and transparency requirements. Most importantly, they included protections for residents who reported concerns or questioned the board, making retaliation a violation that could result in removal from the board. The vote was unanimous. 103 residents voted yes, 0 voted no. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity in Meadowbrook Hills. But even with Patricia gone and the HOA reformed, the legal process continued. Patricia appealed her conviction, arguing that she had not received a fair trial. The appeal was denied. She tried to get her sentence reduced, arguing that 8 years was too harsh. That was also denied. Meanwhile, the HOA's insurance company was pursuing Patricia for restitution. They had paid out the settlement to the affected residents, and now they wanted their money back. They discovered that Patricia had hidden assets, including a rental property in Tucson that she owned through an LLC, and a significant amount of jewelry that she had purchased with stolen funds. The insurance company seized everything they could find, but it still was not enough to cover the full $312,000 Patricia owed. They would be pursuing her for the balance for the rest of her life. I ran into Detective Walsh at a coffee shop about 18 months after Patricia's arrest. He was grabbing coffee before his shift and recognized me. Xavier Yates, right? The HOA case. That is me. How are things going? Good. I wanted to thank you, actually. That case led to a much bigger investigation. We found out Patricia was doing the same thing at 2 other HOAs where she had consulted. We have arrested 3 more people, and we are looking at several other communities. Your willingness to stand up and fight back exposed a whole network of HOA fraud. I was stunned. She was doing this to other communities too? Yeah. She would get herself appointed as a consultant or management company representative, gain control of the finances, and start stealing. She had it down to a system. Your case broke it wide open. I just wanted to keep my emergency exit. Detective Walsh laughed. Sometimes the small things lead to the big things. That door you installed probably saved a lot more than just you and your mother. It saved a lot of communities from being victimized. As time went on, Meadowbrook Hills became known as the neighborhood that stood up to HOA abuse. We started getting contacted by residents from other communities who were dealing with similar issues. Tom and Dana, who had become the unofficial advocates for HOA reform, would meet with these people and share our story. Richard started specializing in HOA disputes and became one of the leading attorneys in Arizona for representing homeowners against abusive boards. My mother celebrated her 80th birthday 2 years after the whole ordeal began. We had a party in our backyard, and most of the neighborhood showed up. Tom gave a toast. 2 years ago, Xavier installed a door to keep his mother safe. That simple act of caring for his family ended up protecting all of us. It took courage to stand up to Patricia, and it took even more courage to keep fighting when she tried to crush him. Xavier, your mother raised a good man, and we are all grateful to have you as a neighbor. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. This was what community was supposed to be about. People looking out for each other, standing up for what was right, and not tolerating bullies who abused their power. The emergency exit remained, a simple steel door painted to match the house. But every time I looked at it, I remembered what it represented. It was not just an exit from a burning building. It was an exit from a toxic situation where people were being victimized. It was a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. 3 years after Patricia's arrest, I received a notification from the county attorney's office. Patricia was being released from prison early due to good behavior and overcrowding. She had served 4.5 years of her 8-year sentence. The notification included a restraining order that prohibited her from coming within 500 feet of my property or having any contact with residents of Meadowbrook Hills. I called Richard to let him know. Do you think she will try anything? Honestly, I doubt it. She lost everything. Her house was foreclosed, she has no money, her reputation is destroyed, and she is a convicted felon. She is probably just trying to rebuild her life somewhere far away from here. Richard was right. Patricia moved to New Mexico after her release and, as far as I know, never came back to Phoenix. The last I heard, she was working in a call center and living in a small apartment, a far cry from the life she had tried to build with stolen money. The HOA continued to thrive under new leadership. Margaret served as president for 2 years before stepping down, and Dana took over after that. The neighborhood became known as one of the best managed communities in Phoenix, with transparent finances, reasonable rules, and a culture of mutual respect. My mother's health declined gradually over the following years, but she remained in our home, safe and comfortable. The emergency exit never needed to be used for an actual fire, but it served its purpose in other ways. It made the house feel safer, and it gave my mother peace of mind knowing there were multiple ways out if something happened. On a warm evening 4 years after the whole ordeal began, I was sitting in my garage working on a woodworking project when I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was a young couple, probably in their late 20s, and they looked nervous. "Are you Xavier Yates?" the man asked. "I am. Can I help you? We are thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood," the woman said. "We heard about what happened with the HOA a few years ago, and we wanted to ask you about it. Is this a good place to live?" I put down my tools and thought about how to answer. I could tell them about the harassment, the legal battles, the stress and anxiety of fighting Patricia. Or I could tell them about what the community had become since then. "It is a great place to live now," I said. "We went through some tough times, but the community came together and fixed the problems. The HOA is transparent, the rules are reasonable, and the neighbors look out for each other. If you are looking for a place to raise a family or just have a peaceful life, this is it." The couple looked relieved. "We heard you had some trouble with an emergency exit," I laughed. "Yeah, that was the start of it all. I installed a code-approved emergency exit, and the HOA president tried to make me remove it. Long story short, she ended up going to prison for embezzlement, and the exit stayed. Sometimes standing up for what is right leads to bigger changes than you expect. Would you do it again?" The man asked. "Absolutely, every time." They thanked me and left, and I went back to my woodworking project, but their question stuck with me. Would I do it again? The answer was easy. Yes, because that emergency exit was not just about my safety or my mother's safety. It was about refusing to be bullied, refusing to accept abuse of power, and refusing to let someone victimize my community. The door remained, a testament to the idea that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can lead to the biggest changes. It was just a door, but it had become so much more. It was a symbol of standing up for what was right, of protecting the vulnerable, and of building a community based on respect rather than fear. 5 years after I installed that emergency exit, Meadowbrook Hills was thriving. Property values had increased, not because of strict aesthetic rules, but because people wanted to live in a community that was well managed and supportive. The HOA had a waiting list of people who wanted to buy houses in the neighborhood, attracted by the reputation for transparency and reasonable governance. I continued to live my life, going to work each day, taking care of my mother, and enjoying the simple pleasures of a peaceful neighborhood. The emergency exit was just part of the house now, no longer a source of conflict but simply another door. But every time I passed it, I remembered the fight, the stress, the eventual victory, and the community that came together to stand against abuse. Tom and I remained close friends, often sitting on his patio in the evenings talking about everything from politics to sports to the state of the neighborhood. Dana became a close friend as well, and her kids grew up playing basketball in my driveway. The Rodriguez family hosted legendary summer barbecues that brought the whole neighborhood together. This was what community was supposed to be, not perfect, but real. People with different backgrounds and different lives coming together to support each other and make their little corner of the world better. And it all started with a simple emergency exit, a code-approved door that one vindictive woman tried to use as a weapon, only to have it become the instrument of her downfall and the community's salvation. As I look back on everything that happened, the clearest lesson is this. When you stand up for what is right, even when it is hard, even when it seems easier to just give in, you never know how many other people you might be helping. That emergency exit saved more than just me and my mother. It saved an entire community from a corrupt leader, exposed a network of fraud, and created a model for how HOAs should operate. The door is still there, solid and secure, a permanent reminder that safety matters more than aesthetics, that laws exist to protect people, not to be ignored by petty tyrants, and that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can change everything.